everyone, today we are going to start with a new chapter, and this is the chapter of biomes. Now when we talk about biomes, talking from the examination perspective, this is a chapter which is important for your prelims examination. In the mains examination, we don't normally expect a question to come from here, and that's why we'll have an approach which is more suited to the prelims exam. Now from the point of view of understanding this chapter, first thing that you need to understand is the definition of biome. How we define biome, how it is different from ecosystem, how it is different from a habitat, and then we'll look into all the factors with respect to biomes and the different kinds of biomes that exist. So first of all, when we talk about biomes, what do we mean? In very simple terms, we are talking about the kinds of vegetation, or basically the kinds of flora and fauna that you find in a given region. And this flora and fauna that you find in a region, this is happening because of climatic conditions. The kind of climatic conditions that have prevailed in a given region for a very long time. And because of these climatic conditions that have prevailed here for a long time, we see that there are animals and plants which have adapted to these kind of conditions. And that's why all the kinds of vegetation that will be found, or the different kinds of organisms that are found, they will all have very similar characteristics. So for example, if you look at this particular picture, what you see here are two different plant forms. Although they might look like cactus to you, but only one of them is cactus. The one that you see here, this one, the first image is the one which can be classified as a cactus. The second plant is not a cactus, although looks very similar. Not only this, what we also see is that this first plant that you are looking at, this is found in North America. But at the same time, when you look at the second picture, this is something which is found in Africa. So something which looks very similar, although two different variants of plants, they look very similar. Why? Because they are growing in similar climatic conditions. So because of these similar climatic conditions that have prevailed in a given region, they become a part of a given biome. So when we say biome, we are talking about the flora and fauna of a given region which has adapted to the environmental conditions, adapted to the climatic conditions of the region for a very long time, and then they show very similar characteristics because they have grown in certain conditions. So when we talk about biomes, so there can be various kinds of biomes, and these are terms that you often know about. For example, forest, desert. We can talk about the aquatic biomes, we can talk about tundra. So these are different types of biomes. You have grasslands, right? So these are the different kinds of biomes that we know of. But even in these biomes, there can be various variations. And how these variations come? They come on the basis of where they are located. For example, when we talk about forests, the forests can be tropical, correct? They can be tropical, but at the same time, they can be found in the temperate regions as well. The forests are being found in the temperate regions and in the tropical regions. So whether they are found in the tropical regions or in the temperate regions, that will also distinguish between the kind of forest that we can have in a given region. Not only this, there are conditions apart from the climate conditions also. For example, what kind of soil is found, what kind of temperatures exist, where they are located in the latitude. These all factors will also lead to certain differences in the kinds of plants and animals that you will look upon. So depending on all these physical factors, we know that there can be different kinds of biomes, and this is what we are going to study about. So when we talk about these concepts, that when you look at these two plants, they look very similar to one another, this is a concept which is also called as convergence. And why convergence? Because they are very similar in the look and feel. They look very similar, they have similar characteristics, although they are different varieties, different species of plants. So this concept of convergence is also something that leads you to how different kinds of biomes can have different kinds of plants and animals. And even if same kind of biome is found in two different continents altogether, even then the kinds of plants that we see could look very, very similar to one another. So this is about biomes. But when we talk about biomes, there can be confusion among the terms like biomes and also a term which we studied in the last chapter, that is ecosystem. So when we talk about ecosystem, how is it different from a biome? How do you define an ecosystem and differentiate it from how we are talking about a biome? So when we talk about an ecosystem, if you go back to the definitions that we saw, we were talking about the interactions, right? We were talking about the interactions between plants and animals, interactions between animals and animals, interactions between plants and plants, and interaction between the plants, animals and their physical environment. That is, it can be an interaction between a biotic and an abiotic component. That is, there can be a biotic component and there can be an abiotic component, right? These are the two terms that we studied about. Biotic are the ones which are living or have been living, and abiotic are the ones which will not live and which haven't been living. For example, all the plants and animals will be biotic, and air, water, soil, etc. will be called as abiotic factors. So it's an interaction between either biotic or biotic abiotic factors which prevail in a given region. So this is something that we will call as an ecosystem. But when we talk about biomes, biomes are basically to do with something of physical in nature. That is, all the physical conditions that prevail in a given region, they will determine what a biome is. So before moving on, we also need to understand what are the differences between a biome and an ecosystem. So when we talk about a biome, these are large naturally occurring communities of flora and fauna which occupy a very major habitat. But when we talk about an ecosystem is an interaction between the biotic and the abiotic factors in a given region. So what can happen is that in a given biome, you can have different ecosystems. For example, if you go back to what we were discussing, a pond can be called as an ecosystem. A tree can be called as an ecosystem. But that's not the case with biomes. Biomes always will be determined for a very large area. They will be determined on the basis of the climatic conditions and other physical factors. So you will not see that a biome is just having a 5-kilometer radius or a 1-kilometer radius. It will be a large area. It takes upon the whole subcontinent. It takes upon the whole set of 5 or 6 different countries altogether. It can sweep an entire continent. So when you talk about biomes, they will be very large physical areas. But when you talk about an ecosystem, they can be large, but most of the times they will be very small as compared to a biome. So this is a basic difference between the two terms that we see. Now there is a third term, and that is the term of habitat. So when we talk about habitat, what do we mean? Habitat, if you go back again to the definition, we discussed about what is habitat and what is niche and how habitat and niche are different. So habitat again will probably be an even smaller entity as compared to an ecosystem. We are just talking about the physical conditions where an organism will be able to survive. We are not talking about the interactions. We are not talking about any other such factor. We are just talking about the conditions where I can live. That will be my habitat, right? So that habitat can be very small, but it can be large as well. So you have to understand what is the difference between the three terms when you talk about a biome, when you talk about an ecosystem, and the habitat. Habitat and ecosystem we have already seen in the previous chapter. Biome is something that we are going to study in this particular chapter. So moving on to what exactly we mean by biome, grouping of biological communities and ecosystems into categories based on climate and dominant plant forms can be called as a biome. In other terms, you can also say that on the basis of physical characteristics, on the basis of various physical factors like climatic conditions, like temperature, like humidity, like soil type, we see that there are various kinds of flora and fauna that will grow in a given geographical condition. And this is something that can be called as a biome. But normally when we talk about a biome, it is characterized by the type of vegetation that you see there. So that's why we talk about the forest, we talk about the grassland, we talk about the tundra. We are talking about all these terms because the primary factor on which we base the classification are the different kinds of plants or the different kinds of flora that is found in a given region. So that becomes a very prime basis on which we define what kind of biome exists in a given region. So if you look at the second point, ecosystems belonging to the same biome type in different parts of the world develop a very similar vegetation structure and a similar ecosystem functioning, including the productivity and the rates of nutrient cycle under similar environmental conditions. So this is what we have been talking about, that one biome can accommodate different kinds of ecosystems, and all these different ecosystems will be found on the basis of the kind of biome that we have. We'll see that there can be various kinds, and there will be very small ecosystems, many such small ecosystems that will be found in a given biome. So that's why there is a difference here, and that's why you have to understand the meaning of biome and how to differentiate between the two terms. Because see, if you talk about the prelims examination It can be a very simple, confusing question that can be asked. Consider the following statements. And after this, you have been given three statements. One, which is the definition of a biome. Second, which is the definition of an ecosystem. Third, which is a definition of habitat. And fourth can be the definition of niche. And they can give you these four in one column. They can give you the definitions in the second column, and they can ask you to match. Or rather, they can give you all the four, and then they can ask you which among the above given statements are correct definitions for the terms that have been indicated. So they can mix and match here, and they can try to confuse you. So you have to understand that the meaning of all these terms have to be very clear in these. So you have to understand that the meanings of all these terms have to be very clear in your minds. The definitions have to be very clear in your minds. The examples have to be very clear in your minds. So when you do this, you will be able to crack such a question simply. There will be no problem that you will face here. There has been a question that has been asked. We saw that there was a question asked on the definition of an ecosystem. There has been a question that has been asked on the basis of the difference between habitat and niche. So all these kind of possibilities do exist, that they can try and ask you a question on the differences between biomes and ecosystems, biomes and habitats, habitat and ecosystem. All these possibilities exist. So this is about the basics of biomes. Now the next thing that we need to understand are the various determinants which help us understand what kind of flora will be found according to the regions we are in. So first thing that we know, which we have established, is about the climatic conditions. That according to the various climatic conditions, you will see that the characteristics of the flora and the fauna that is found in a given region will change. And for similar climatic conditions, you will find that the flora for that particular condition is similar, right? But there are other factors as well. First of which are the physical factors. So when we talk about the physical factors for terrestrial biomes, what are the key determinants? First, of course, is climate. But apart from that, topography also matters, soil also matters. If we talk about aquatic biomes, in that case, the depth, water temperature, flow rate, and oxygen and nutrient concentrations will also matter. So if we look at terrestrial, for terrestrial, we know that the temperature is a big determinant. Soil type is a big determinant. But at the same time, humidity and precipitation, they are also very big determinants of what kind of biome will have what kind of flora. Not only this, there are other factors as well. One of which could be biological factors. And these biological factors are mainly to do with the different kinds of ecosystems. That is the kinds of interactions that you are looking at in a given region. So that becomes another key factor. Then there is the historical data. That is, when you look at the distribution in the world, this distribution has also been changing over millions of years, but we have seen that the changes have happened. So this is another kind of data that needs to be taken into account. So if we talk about the determinants, determinants could be physical, determinants could be biological, and they can be historic. All these are possible. Now, even if we talk about, let's say, species of mango. So we know that in India, there are various species of mangoes that are found. All these have very similar biomes. But according to some similar conditions and some different conditions, we see that these mango variants are also a bit different. All of them can be classified as a species of mango, but there are different variations that have come in only because of the fact that there are small changes here and there that have happened, and that's why they have a particular ecosystem in the given biome that we have. So all these factors matter a lot. Then there are various kinds of trees and plants which grow according to the situation. For example, if we take evergreen forest. So why evergreen forest? Because the temperature and the precipitation conditions are so good that the trees can grow all year long. They will shed their leaves, but the regrowth of the plants and the regrowth of the leaves will be also very, very fast. But if you talk about temperate forests, or even in tropical regions, if you talk about the deciduous forests are seasonal. So what happens is that you will see that the growth of leaves will happen after the monsoon season, if you consider India for example. But after a point of time, once the rainfall has stopped, once the source of water has stopped, you know that all these trees also start to shed their leaves. But after a point in time, again there will be a regrowth of leaves that will happen. So these kind of seasonality is seen in deciduous forests. So the characteristics of all these trees are different as compared to the trees that you see in evergreen forest. When you go to a grassland, what do you see? In grasslands, there are hardly any trees. Why? Because the water content, the precipitation that happens there is very less. Humidity in the atmosphere is very less. And because of that, the trees cannot grow properly, and that's why the kind of vegetation that will be seen in these parts will be more or less based on grasses. There will be small herbs, there can be shrubs, but it will be majorly grasses. So that's why these can be called as grasslands, and that also happens because of the rainfall, precipitation, climatic conditions, soil type, etc. So that determine all these kinds of trees and plants which can grow in these areas. So the physical factors, the biological factors, and the historic factors, they all come into the account, but the most important part is being played by climate, and the role of climate becomes of utmost importance when you talk about the kinds of biomes that we see. For example, when you talk about climate, whether you talk about temperature, whether you talk about humidity or the moisture availability, or you talk about the nature of soil, all these are the factors that are primarily due to climatic conditions or the variations in the climatic conditions that we see. So all these are sub parts of, you can say, a climatic condition that can be found in a given region. So according to all these different kinds of conditions that we see, the different kinds of flora and the different kinds of fauna that is found in a given region will be determined due to all these factors. So based on all these factors that we have just discussed, German ecologist Heinrich Walter had classified the biomes on the basis of the climatic zones, and this is something that is the major division that was done by him. You see tropical rainforests, you see subtropical desert, woodland, temperate rainforest, temperate seasonal forest, temperate grasslands, boreal forest, tundra. All these are the different kinds of classification that he had done, and this was basically on the basis of the climate zone, and this was basically on the basis of the temperature and the precipitation that basically is observed in all these regions. So what are these tropical rainforests? So just look at this. You have some for tropical, you have some for temperate, you then have the boreal forest, and then you have the tundra. So these are different zones, and these different zones are on the basis of what? On the basis of latitude. Why? Because on the basis of latitude, there will be vast differences in climate conditions that will be observed. So these all climatic zones can be determined on that basis, and all the vegetation that you see, the characteristics of the vegetation. We are not talking about the different kinds of species. We are talking about the characteristics of those species. Characteristics of all that vegetation that is found, they will be very similar to one another. The picture that we had seen, for example, in the very beginning of the lecture, and that was about the concept of convergence, right? So in convergence, what we basically understood was that different kinds of vegetation, different kinds of flora and fauna will adapt to a certain climatic condition, and their characteristics will be determined by these climatic conditions. So they can be various different kinds of species, but they will have very similar characteristics, and that's why the two pictures that we saw, they looked very similar, although they were completely two different species of plants. So this is what happens, and this chart basically can probably directly become important for you in the prelims examination. We have seen questions in the past where they have given hints about the vegetation type and the kinds of temperatures, etc., that are found in a given region, and then they ask you which kind of climatic zone or which kind of biome suits these kind of conditions that we have just discussed. Or they can give you examples. They can give you examples of flora, and then they can ask you a question on this kind of flora can be found in which of the following kinds of biomes. So then you have to understand all these different classifications that we are making. Primarily, you can say that it's about forests, deserts, tundra, etc. But at the same time, the forest can be temperate, forest can be tropical, forest can be deciduous, forest can be evergreen. All these kind of classifications and the various modifications have to be understood. So on the basis of temperature and precipitation, we see that all these different kinds that we are looking at, they can be summed up in this manner. So for example, when we are talking about very high annual precipitation and we are talking about high average temperature, mind this, that this is high and this is low. So when the temperature is high and the precipitation is high, then in that case, the kind of vegetation that will be suitable will be equatorial rainforest. So tropical rainforest will be seen in this kind of a condition. On the same page, if you look at boreal, so when we talk about boreal, we are talking about very less rains and also very low temperatures. Tundra, even lower temperatures and lower rainfall. So on the basis of rainfall and on the basis of temperature, this is how everything can be summed up in one single diagram. So these two diagrams that we have seen, You have to understand these two. You have to go through these two. Pause it here. Make sure that you understand this, and then only you move forward. Because after this, one by one, we'll keep on moving from one zone, one biome to another. And in this manner, we'll look into all the climatic conditions, all the conditions which are suitable for them, the various examples of the flora and fauna that can be found in this region. All these are the kinds of things that we'll look into. But before that, I would suggest that you just pause the screen for a minute and look at the last two diagrams that we have seen, because this is the basic of everything that we are going to observe in the upcoming part of the lecture.